whispers from the vault, unveiling the Vatican's unspoken history. Deep beneath the bustling heart of Rome lies an enigmatic sanctuary, a place where access is granted only by exclusive permission. It is not a museum displaying historical artifacts, but rather a colossal repository where history itself is meticulously secured. Concealed within the innermost chambers behind a formidable triple barrier of iron doors, in rooms where no echo dares to linger. Here, the Vatican has meticulously safeguarded millions of documents for over 12 centuries, not for immediate disclosure, but for a profound, patient waiting. Among these silent witnesses are handwritten letters from popes that were destined never to be sent, crucial bindings on books that once reshaped the world, and meticulously compiled records of Marian apparitions that were quietly set aside. These archives also hold the hushed dialogues between the Vatican and powerful emperors, ruthless fascists, and formidable Western intelligence agencies, alongside artistic masterpieces the world has yet to behold. The profound question arises: why does the Vatican meticulously preserve these invaluable treasures, yet abstain from ever speaking of them publicly? This narrative transcends mere conspiracy theories. It delves into the very core of the most profoundly interred memories within the global tapestry of faith. Welcome to Secrets of the Vatican Archives, where our purpose is not to reiterate familiar tales, but to painstakingly unearth what was always intended to remain concealed. I was once among the select few privileged to gain entry into the restricted sections of these venerable Vatican archives. To be clear, I held no cardinalate, nor was I a renowned historian. And certainly, no noble lineage flowed through my veins. My role was simply that of a caretaker, a custode, as the Italians eloquently say. My duties encompass cleaning, taking meticulous notes, and delivering sanctioned documents to eager scholars. Yet, on certain hushed nights, when the venerable old priest had drifted into slumber, and the oil lamp cast its gentle glow in the corner, I would furtively open doors that no other soul dared to approach. From that precise moment, there was no possibility of turning back. I am acutely aware now that my time is swiftly drawing to a close. In these twilight years, my heart's rhythm slows, my vision dims in the soft candlelight, and my hands, once intimately familiar with parchment as if it were my own skin, now begin to tremble with each touch. But before all this knowledge vanishes with me, I am compelled to speak. My intent is not to provoke shock, nor to accuse, nor to grant absolution, but simply so that someone, somewhere, might grasp these profound truths. Truth, in its essence, has never fully belonged to either the radiant light or the profound darkness. It resides in the delicate space between, patiently awaiting its moment to be heard. I have gazed upon the unsent letters of Pope Pius IX, resting undisturbed in an unmarked drawer. I have pored over forbidden copies of books once branded as threats to the very bedrock of faith. I have stood in silent contemplation before Caravaggio's paintings that were never allowed public display. For the piercing eyes within those portraits seemed to stare directly into a depth of pain that theology itself dared not confront. And above all, I have come to comprehend that what we are forbidden to unveil is not concealed because it is false, but precisely because it is too profoundly true to be readily accepted. I do not ask for your belief. I cannot offer the kind of tangible proof the world readily acknowledges. Yet, if you are still listening, if your eyes still trace these words, and if, deep within your being, you still believe that beneath every hallowed glory there lies an unresolved, deeper stratum of truth, then perhaps you are the one to whom I must impart this. For one day, those doors will not remain perpetually sealed. And when they finally swing open, you will fully comprehend why I could never return. The veiled world of the Vatican's secret archives. I once harbored the simple conviction that the Vatican was merely a spiritual emblem, a hallowed ground for prayers, where popes in their pristine white robes stood openly in the grandeur of St. Peter's Square. But that perception was merely the surface. Beyond the ancient, time-worn stone walls, beneath the majestic, towering domes, and behind doors secured with intricate triple mechanisms, exists around that the vast majority of humanity will never be permitted to witness. The world of the Vatican's secret archives. Although popularly referred to as the Vatican Secret Archives, its official Latin designation is Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, which translates to the private archive of the Pope. The Latin term, secretum, does not connote secret in the contemporary sense, but rather private. This distinction is crucial. The archive is the Pope's personal property. It does not belong to the wider Catholic Church. Yet, it is precisely this inherent privacy that has rendered this extraordinary place the nexus of countless theories, ranging from profound political investigations to the relentless quest for lost legends. The archive itself spans an astonishing 85 kilometers of shelving, housing over 35,000 catalogued entries that chronicle events from the 8th century to the present day. However, only a modest fraction of this immense collection is accessible to scholars. The most exquisitely sensitive, strictly classified, or yet to be released documents remain perpetually sealed deep within the innermost vaults. And it is within these guarded depths that some of the most pivotal and contentious moments in the annals of European and Christian history are meticulously preserved. Among these treasured items is an authenticated copy of the letter Galileo Galilei dispatched to the Church in 1613, wherein he endeavored to assert that his astronomical perspectives did not, in fact, contradict biblical teachings. Nevertheless, in 1616, the Church formally denounced heliocentrism as heretical and strictly prohibited its dissemination. Subsequently, in 1633, Galileo faced trial by the Inquisition, a tribunal whose intricate proceedings are also thoroughly documented within these very archives. One of the most frequently sought-after collections pertains to the infamous trial of the Knights Templar in the 14th century. For hundreds of years, it was widely believed that the Vatican had systematically destroyed all records of this contentious trial. However, in 2001, an Italian scholar named Barbara Frail unearthed a copy of the Pergamentum Sinu, a revelatory document disclosing that Pope Clement V had, in secret, absolved the Templars. This discovery directly contradicted the deeply entrenched belief that the Church had consented to their eradication, raising a profoundly unsettling question. Why was such a truth suppressed for over 7 centuries? Furthermore, the archives contain critical documents illuminating the Vatican's complex relationships with authoritarian regimes of the 20th century, most notably Nazi Germany. Hundreds of letters exchanged between the Vatican and Hitler's regime are meticulously preserved, alongside reports dispatched from German bishops to the Holy See. These materials compellingly suggest that the Vatican possessed early intelligence regarding the systematic mass killings of Jews. However, their subsequent response was deeply intricate. Influenced by a confluence of faith, pragmatic political calculation, and a pervasive fear of persecution. In a momentous shift in 2020, after decades of swirling controversy, the Vatican at last opened a portion of the archives pertinent to Pope Pius XII, who guided the Church from 1939 to 1958, encompassing the tumultuous years of World War II. This was a groundbreaking event for historians, as Pius XII had long been vehemently accused of maintaining a culpable silence during the Holocaust. The newly unveiled documents painted a more nuanced and complex portrait. While not entirely silent, he opted to act covertly behind the scenes to safeguard lives. A strategy that continues to ignite fervent debate regarding its moral efficacy and ethical implications. Beyond ecclesiastical affairs, the archives are a treasure trove of cultural and historical artifacts. They house handwritten letters by the incomparable Michelangelo, exquisite sketches by Bernini, a poignant farewell note from Mary, Queen of Scots, penned just prior to her execution, and even a letter from a Native American chief addressed to the Pope in the 19th century. The Vatican archives thus serve as a magnificent gateway, interweaving all threads of history, from the visceral bloodshed of the Crusades to the transformative revolutions of science. from profound theological schisms to intricate modern political intrigues. Despite possessing such an unparalleled wealth of historical knowledge, access to the archive remains rigorously restricted. Annually, only approximately 60 to 80 scholars are granted the immense privilege of on-site study. These scholars must submit formal applications, meticulously specify their research topics, and adhere to an exacting set of rules. No photography, no photocopies, and absolutely no documents are permitted to leave the designated study room. Most crucially, no individual is ever granted unrestricted access. The most sensitive areas remain perpetually sealed. My intention is not to draw definitive conclusions, nor do I assert possession of all truths. However, I firmly believe that when one stands before the seemingly endless shelves, with centuries of dust gently settled upon trembling handwritten lines dating back to the 10th century, one begins to fathom why the Vatican guards this sacred place with such profound vigilance. Some truths are simply too expansive, too overwhelming, to be fully exposed. Some narratives, once fully revealed, would compel us to fundamentally question the very bedrock of our civilization and the tenets of our faith. If there exists a singular document capable of illustrating the profound sensitivity and immense power harbored within the Vatican Archives, it would undoubtedly be the records pertaining to Christianity's Great Schism, the monumental division between Catholicism and Protestantism. Few are aware that in the nascent stages of the Reformation, clandestine exchanges between Martin Luther and certain Vatican representatives were meticulously documented. These handwritten notes, rendered in slanted brown ink, once moved a Dutch scholar to profound tears, not due to theological disagreement, but because the documents starkly revealed that both factions had, at one point, genuinely strived to avert the impending rupture, only to be inexorably driven apart by the corrosive forces of pride and power. As early as the 1530s, the Vatican discreetly dispatched envoys to the German principalities to engage in negotiations with the burgeoning reformist factions. Among these documents are compelling statements by Bishop Girolamo Aleandro, a theologian and diplomat who, in a rare display of concession, once proposed theological compromises to safeguard the unity of the Church. Yet when Luther's responses arrived, cautious yet resolute, the Church recoiled, and history veered onto an irreversible trajectory. These sensitive materials are now preserved within a sealed dossier, accessible exclusively to individuals possessing advanced research credentials and an unequivocally justified purpose. Shadows of the Past, Inquisition Empires, and Lost Maps. Another subject that once sent a profound chill down my spine was the meticulously kept records of the Inquisition. The Vatican still holds thousands of chilling indictments, unsettling interrogation transcripts, and solemn death sentences from those accused of heresy between the 12th and 19th centuries. One of the most infamous cases documented is that of Giordano Bruno, a brilliant philosopher, astrologer, and fervent advocate for the theory of a boundless universe. The documents concerning Bruno unveil not only his intellectual arguments, but also the deep internal conflict experienced by the clergy tasked with judging him. In one poignant internal note, a cleric penned, "If we spare him, doctrine will waver, but if we burn him, history will never forgive us." Ultimately, Bruno was executed in 1600 at Campo de' Fiori. The profound silence that descended for centuries thereafter remains one of the clearest reflections of the enduring tension between the realms of faith and knowledge. The archives also contain an extensive collection of records detailing the Vatican's intricate interactions with secular empires, particularly with Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon invaded Italy, he notoriously commanded that the most valuable Vatican documents be transported to Paris. Tens of thousands of items were meticulously boxed, sealed, and carried across the formidable Alps. Many of these treasures never found their way back. What the Vatican did manage to reclaim following Napoleon's defeat remains specially classified to this day. I once encountered a handwritten note by Pope Pius II, eloquently describing the visceral sensation of witnessing the soul of the Church being loaded onto French wagons as ancient texts were carted away. The document was inscribed in charcoal ink with small, meticulous script, and at its very bottom, a single, haunting line read, "We have been stripped bare." One of the most surprising revelations emerges from the diplomatic correspondence between the Vatican and Asian nations. Few are aware that in the 17th century, the Vatican secretly exchanged letters with the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan, even during a period when Christianity was strictly forbidden there. These letters were ingeniously delivered by Portuguese missionaries, cunningly hidden within merchant ships and concealed inside small wooden statues to evade detection. One particular letter from 1611, personally commissioned by Tokugawa Ieyasu himself, unequivocally stated, "We do not accept a faith that divides families, but we respect the knowledge and loyalty your missionaries bring." The Vatican meticulously preserved this letter as a quiet testament to the first, ultimately unsuccessful, diplomatic overture with a profoundly insular Asian empire. And then there exists a lesser-known section of the archive specifically dedicated to maps and blueprints of lost churches, monasteries, fortresses, and catacombs. Among them are intricate maps delineating the precise locations of ancient dioceses that vanished due to the ravages of war, devastating plagues, or dramatic political upheavals. One that continues to haunt me is the floor plan of Montségur Abbey, the site of a brutal siege and mass burning in 1244 during the Crusade against the Cathars. On that particular map, there is a peculiar marking, an escape route that appears in no official records. No one knows if the last Cathars successfully managed to flee. But the document remains, neither confirmed nor denied. And like so many other profound secrets held within this archive, it stands as a stark reminder that history has never been a simple, straightforward narrative. Deep within the most heavily guarded section of the archives, one particular room stands out in my memory. This space holds records meticulously categorized under the political affiliations between the Vatican and global powers, spanning from the 19th century to the present day. The boxes are arranged with meticulous precision by country, each one a fragile fragment of memory, a pristine piece of truth untouched by the narratives found in official historical accounts. Most people are aware that the Vatican achieved independent statehood in 1929 following the Lateran Treaty between Pope Pius XI and Benito Mussolini. However, few truly comprehend that prior to this, from 1870, when the Kingdom of Italy annexed the Papal States, the Vatican existed in a state of near isolation for nearly 60 years. It was, in essence, a nation without physical borders, existing solely within the very heart of Rome. During this tense period, the Pope steadfastly refused to acknowledge the Italian government, and never ventured beyond the Vatican walls. And it was precisely within this volatile era that the Church quietly constructed an intricate network of clandestine communication with other nations, particularly France, Austria, Spain, and the United States. One document from 1922 reveals a fascinating detail. The Vatican once dispatched a confidential message to U.S. President Warren G. Harding, offering to serve as a mediator between America and the fragmented Catholic nations in post-World War I Europe. This intriguing episode has never surfaced in official history books, primarily because the Vatican lacked legal state status at that time. Yet, the memorandum undeniably exists, its signature and seal perfectly intact. When I first touched it, the paper was brittle, its corners darkened by the relentless passage of time, but the text itself was remarkably vivid, as if history itself were whispering directly into my ear. The era of World War II unleashed an avalanche of profoundly sensitive material. Dozens of reports sent from local bishops to the Vatican explicitly document the horrific mass murder of Jews in Poland, Germany, and even France. One particularly harrowing report, dated 1942 and originating from Kovno, was penned by Cardinal Adam Sapieha, who later became the spiritual advisor to Pope John Paul II. He wrote, "If we do not speak, we will bear the guilt of complicity before God." Yet, even such urgent pleas were met with silence. Why did the Vatican postpone its condemnation of such an unspeakable genocide? Scholars have long debated whether this was a strategic decision to safeguard the Church and its followers in occupied territories. However, one document I once read, handwritten by a member of the Papal Council, unveiled a deeper, more agonizing complexity. It cautioned against the perilous risk of losing control over the faithful if belief were to be drawn into the maelstrom of political ideology. In essence, the Vatican genuinely feared that taking a definitive side might fracture the global Church itself. That profound silence persisted until the 1960s, a period when the Vatican initiated one of the most significant reforms in modern Church history, the Second Vatican Council. The extensive files from that council constitute one of the largest and most intricate sections of the archive. Thousands of pages meticulously document theological debates, political responses, verbatim transcripts of bishop speeches, and penetrating analyses of the Church's shifting authority in a world undergoing rapid, tumultuous change. I once read the transcript of a heated debate between two high-ranking cardinals concerning whether to permit the use of local languages instead of Latin during Massachusetts. One asserted, "If we abandon Latin, we abandon the symbol of eternity." The other retorted, "If we don't change, we abandon the people." The council's significance extended far beyond mere linguistic considerations. It marked the Vatican's inaugural genuine opening to dialogue with Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, and even atheists. The archive still holds an unpublished draft of a speech in which Pope Paul VI intended to issue a formal apology for the Vatican's silence during the Holocaust. Ultimately, the speech was replaced with a more neutral version, and the precise reason remains unknown. Only a handwritten note in the margin, in Latin, offers a cryptic clue. Tempus nondum advenit, the time has not yet come. As I carefully turned the pages of these records, I never encountered the kind of grand global conspiracy that sensational theories often posit. What I witnessed was a profound struggle between the immutable tenets of faith and the shifting currents of politics, between moral imperatives and the stark realities of survival. The Vatican Archives do not distort the truth. They patiently await someone brave and perceptive enough to read, to comprehend, and to accept that history has never been a stark dichotomy of black or white, but rather an eternal spectrum of gray. The Church and Empires. A complicated legacy. There is one section of the archives that has consistently weighed heavily upon my soul. The meticulously preserved records concerning the intricate relationship between the Vatican and colonial empires, particularly spanning the 15th to 19th centuries. The faded pages within those ancient boxes contain no direct accusations, no formal declarations of support for war, nor any explicit endorsement of the stripping away of human freedom. Yet, subtly woven between the carefully inscribed lines lies a quiet, undeniable truth. Faith once marched hand in hand with the sword of European colonialism as it relentlessly expanded its reach across the globe. In 1493, a mere year after Christopher Columbus's momentous arrival in the New World, Pope Alexander VI issued the papal bull, Inter Caetera. In this sweeping decree, he unilaterally divided the non-Christian world into two distinct zones of influence, one allocated to Spain, the other to Portugal, as if the Church possessed the inherent authority to apportion global territories. That very document still reposes within the Vatican Archives, meticulously filed within a thick folder labeled Decrees Concerning the New World. It is composed in formal Latin, bearing the striking crimson seal of the Holy See. Holding it in my hands, a profound chill permeated me, for this document marked a pivotal moment when faith was overtly politicized to its most extreme degree. Attached to this decree are numerous letters exchanged between the Vatican and the monarchs of Portugal, Spain, and in later years, France and Belgium. In these correspondences, the Pope sought assurances for the unfettered dissemination of the faith and the rigorous protection of missionaries within newly acquired territories. However, the stark reality on the ground was often characterized by brutal bloodshed, relentless cultural erasure, and desperate pleas for intervention from dissenting clergy. Their voices, though few in number, are preserved, like flickering sparks of light piercing through a profound darkness. One such voice was that of Father Bartolomé de las Casas, who penned a searing letter to Pope Paul III in 1537. In his correspondence, he graphically described the mass executions of indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, churches constructed upon blood-soaked soil, and the chilling silence of religious authorities in the face of such monstrous atrocities. Reading that letter was a suffocating experience. It felt less like a prayer and more like a desperate plea for succor, not only for the hapless victims but for the very conscience of the Church itself. Also meticulously preserved in the archives is a draft of the Apostolic Brief, Sublimis Deus, issued in 1537 by Pope Paul III. In this document, he unequivocally declared that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were truly human, possessing souls and the inherent right to receive the gospel, and that they should unequivocally not be enslaved. It was, for its time, a remarkably progressive document. Yet, tragically, its practical application was swiftly rescinded under intense pressure from European monarchs who staunchly refused to relinquish the immense economic gains derived from slavery. As one delves into the 19th century, the Vatican's diplomatic role in safeguarding religious interests within African and Asian colonies becomes increasingly discernible. In the archives related to Indochina, I once meticulously reviewed a thick dossier detailing the pervasive presence of French missionaries in Vietnam prior to the French invasion. There were letters dispatched back to Rome describing the immense pressures faced by Catholic converts under the Nguyen dynasty. However, intricately interwoven into these reports were phrases such as opportunity to expand influence and mediating role with Western merchants, lines that starkly reveal how faith and secular power had begun to merge in ways that were increasingly difficult to disentangle. It is imperative to underscore that the Vatican did not directly instigate colonial conquests. Yet, through its stamps of approval, its formal blessings, and the moral legitimacy it extended, one can unmistakably trace the Church's complicit role in validating empires and in assuaging the consciences of those who conquered. The Vatican Archives also contain numerous records that reveal internal dissent. Not a few courageous priests, monks, and bishops vociferously protested the flagrant abuse of religion for colonial purposes. One compelling document from 1885 recounts the story of a French bishop in the Congo who submitted a formal protest to the Vatican after witnessing hundreds of people brutally having their hands severed for failing to meet rubber quotas demanded by King Leopold II's company. The Vatican's response was concisely recorded in a single, chilling line: "We pray for them, but intervention is beyond reach." Perhaps this is precisely why the Vatican Archives are not merely a static repository of memory. They are, profoundly, a mirror, reflecting the fragile boundary that exists between the spiritual realm of faith and the temporal domain of politics, between righteousness and raw power. As I gaze upon the cracked red wax seals, the distinctive signatures of popes, cardinals, kings, and merchants, I am starkly reminded that history is never linear. And the Vatican, for all its revered sanctity, was once an active participant in decisions that irrevocably reshaped the very course of human civilization. The Cold War and the Church's shifting influence. If one harbored the belief that the Vatican's intricate involvement in politics concluded in the Middle Ages or during the tumultuous period of World War II, they might be astonished to discover that the archives continued to meticulously record significant historical moments well into the latter half of the 20th century. One of the most securely guarded sections within the Vatican Archives houses the diplomatic records detailing the Holy See's profound engagement with global powers during the Cold War, particularly in the regions of Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the formidable Soviet Union. I vividly recall the first time I gained access to the voluminous file pertaining to Poland in the 1970s, a pivotal period when the Solidarity movement began to emerge as a potent symbol of anti-communist resistance. Many are aware that Pope John Paul II, the first Polish pope, staunchly supported this movement. However, few truly comprehend that the Vatican, utilizing covert channels, clandestinely dispatched funds, vital printing equipment, and even intelligence to various opposition groups. These decisive actions are clearly and thoroughly documented in the internal reports. One compelling memorandum, sent from the Vatican Secretariat of State to the Apostolic Nuncio in Warsaw, bears the unmistakable handwritten note of Cardinal Casaroli. This is not only a defense of faith. This is a moment of survival. These documents strikingly reveal that the Vatican was far from a mere passive observer. It operated as a sophisticated political actor, deftly employing soft power to influence major shifts within the global order. Poland was not the solitary focus of the Vatican's interventions. The Holy See also intervened deeply in the complex political landscape of Latin America. In one confidential file concerning Argentina during the years 1976 to 1983, the harrowing period of the Dirty War, I encountered deeply troubling reports, desperate pleas from local bishops, chilling lists of kidnapped priests, and the Vatican's agonizingly conflicted responses. One telegram from Buenos Aires made direct reference to Father Carlos Mujica, who was brutally assassinated for his unwavering support of the impoverished and his courageous opposition to military violence. Yet the Vatican's terse reply simply stated, "We cannot publicly take sides in an internal conflict." That single sentence lingered with me for a considerable duration, not because it was entirely erroneous, but because it reflected the Vatican's deeply ingrained traditional strategy: to act discreetly, maintain a facade of public neutrality, yet offer subtle, private support to the side it deemed just. In Chile, during the oppressive rule of Augusto Pinochet, the archives illuminate periods of profound silence interspersed with moments of indirect pressure. A fully recorded private meeting between Cardinal Angelo Sodano and Chilean military leaders includes a message conveying concern that the Church is being perceived as a refuge for enemies of the regime. Simultaneously, records conclusively confirm that the Vatican protected priests who were sheltering political fugitives, not through public decrees, but via internal memos requesting the reinstatement of dismissed bishops who harbored sympathies for the opposition. The Cold War also introduced profoundly complex dynamics into the Vatican's relationship with the formidable Soviet Union. Although Catholicism faced severe persecution within Soviet territories, the Vatican diligently maintained discreet communication channels. A typewritten report dated March 12, 1962, meticulously details a confidential meeting between an unofficial Vatican envoy and a representative of Khrushchev's government in Vienna. The ensuing conversation was not explosive. They discussed matters of religious freedom and clerical safety. However, the very fact that such a meeting transpired conveyed an unequivocal message. The Vatican was willing to engage in dialogue if it meant saving lives and preserving faith. It is important to acknowledge that the Vatican did not invariably align itself with the side of justice, at least not in the manner the outside world often hoped. In the case of Spain under General Franco's authoritarian regime, the Vatican sustained diplomatic relations with the dictatorship for decades. Some scholars interpret this as a strategic compromise with authoritarianism aimed at protecting the faithful. Letters meticulously preserved in the archives vividly demonstrate that bishops could express disagreement, but ultimately, they adhered to orders emanating from higher authority. For a considerable time, I mistakenly believed that the Vatican archives would be replete with mystical secrets, ancient scriptures, or lost relics. However, after years of diligent study, I have come to a profound understanding. The most shocking discoveries are not phenomena beyond history, but rather truths that are overwhelmingly real, too political, too intimately connected to what still envelopes us today. These are truths that many would rather not confront. The Vatican is not a supernatural force. It is a unique political religious entity that operates with meticulous logic, strategic foresight, and careful calculation. And its archives, not the resplendent stained glass windows or the sacred statues, are the very place where this intricate reality is laid bare in its most unvarnished form. The unveiling of Pius XII, silence, diplomacy, and the Holocaust. Of all the rooms I have had the privilege to enter within the Vatican Archives, none has left me as profoundly silent as the one designated P12 Pest. This name, inextricably linked to the Pope who reigned from 1939 to 1958, a period almost entirely coinciding with World War II and the immediate post-war era, remains at the epicenter of one of the most enduring and contentious debates in modern history. Did the Vatican, under Pius XII, do enough, speak out sufficiently? Or did it remain silent for an unconscionably long duration in the face of the 20th century's most brutal genocide? For decades, the records pertaining to Pius XII were meticulously sealed, thus deeply polarizing historians globally. Some have disparagingly labeled him the Pope of Silence. Others staunchly defend him as a cautious diplomat, forced into a strategic silence to preserve lives that public condemnations could never have saved. Then, in 2020, when the Vatican officially declassified a significant portion of the documents from his papacy, a wave of profound astonishment swept through the scholarly world. I was among the privileged few present at the archives when these materials were first unveiled. I distinctly recall the first time I carefully unfolded the file simply titled Santori der. The activities of the Holy Father during the conflict. Inside were countless letters, reports, and telegrams, many originating from bishops in Germany, Poland, and Hungary, sent between 1941 and 1944. One particularly poignant letter from the Archbishop of Lviv, dated March 16, 1942, described in chilling detail how over 1,000 Jewish residents were brutally expelled from the town without formal charges or any official sentence. At its conclusion, he desperately pleaded with the Vatican to intervene or, at the very least, to speak out. The Vatican's response, attached immediately thereafter, consisted of only a few concise lines. We share in the sorrow, but prayer is the most powerful weapon we possess at this moment. It was not an outright refusal to help, but it was unequivocally an action insufficient to halt the horrifying events unfolding. There was a thick folder, separately marked, titled Richieste di aiuto elo, requests for help and asylum. Inside were hundreds of heartfelt personal appeals from Jews, priests, scholars, and even artists, writing directly to the Holy See for protection. Some were indeed assisted, hidden in convents, aided by courageous nuns, or provided with forged documents identifying them as Catholics to evade detection by German forces. However, many others received no reply whatsoever. One particular page utterly froze me in place. It was a handwritten list of 44 names. Beside each name were their addresses, religions, ages, and a chilling note. Sheltered at the Santa Brigida convent. The document was dated October 10, 1943, a mere 3 days after German forces commenced rounding up Jews in Rome. Of the 44 individuals listed, cross-reference records reveal that only 12 ultimately survived. And then there is a detail known to few, something only discernible to those who have meticulously read the pages themselves. Between 1942 and 1944, the Vatican dispatched multiple communiques to the German embassy in Rome, requesting a reduction in persecution in areas where Catholic Jews resided. These letters were never made public. They contained no strong condemnatory language, no use of the word crime, and no explicit mention of genocide. Instead, they articulated concerns in diplomatic terms, anxieties regarding social stability, and the necessity to safeguard the sacred right to life. Perhaps that was the only viable language left in that desperate moment. But for future generations, that ingrained caution has remained a profound source of sorrow and ongoing debate. The archive also preserves an entire chapter dedicated to post-war appeals from Jewish communities. In 1945, a delegation representing European Jewry wrote to the Holy See, seeking confirmation that Catholic institutions had indeed sheltered Jewish children during the war and requesting that these children be reunited with their surviving relatives. The Vatican's response was, We will permit it only if the children choose freely to leave their current environment. However, many of these children were only 5 or 6 years old at the time. Most remembered nothing beyond the convent walls and the faith into which they had recently been baptized. That moral wound would remain tragically open for years. Among the thousands of pages, I came across a draft of a speech, never delivered, prepared for Easter of 1943. In it one line read, "We cannot close our eyes to the cries of a people cast out. Though they do not bear the name of Christ, they are still human beings." That powerful line never reached the public. The final version of the speech was revised, and that passage was removed, with no explanation provided. Only a red stamp remained. Reservato non are reserved. Do not publish. What I witnessed does not grant me the right to draw definitive conclusions. I was not in their shoes. I did not bear the immense weight of a global institution during wartime. But I comprehend why many refer to the Vatican Archives as a place of delayed truths. Not because those truths were lost, but because no one was truly ready to confront them until much later. Catholicism and Asia. A confluence of faith and culture. People often perceive the Vatican as an exclusively Western institution, inextricably linked to Europe and the historical trajectory of Christianity on the old continent. However, the documents meticulously buried deep within the archives reveal a strikingly different reality. From a very nascent stage, the Vatican harbored a vision that transcended geographical borders, reaching expansively towards the east. It was within those yellowed pages that I first grasped the true scale of the Church's missionary ambitions, its earnest attempts at interfaith dialogue, and the profound, often conflicting encounters between Catholicism and the diverse cultures of Asia. One particular section of the archives is prominently titled, Mission d'Orient, Eastern Missions. It contains thousands of documents dating from the 16th to the 20th centuries, inscribed in Latin, Italian, French, Classical Chinese, and Japanese. These extensive texts chronicle centuries of European missionaries journeying eastward, carrying not only the sacred Bible but also the values of an entirely distinct world. I began my exploration with a file simply labeled, Sine Lire de Jesuiti. This is a compelling collection of letters dispatched by Jesuit priests to the Vatican from China between 1580 and 1773. Among them, the profound writings of Matteo Ricci, the very first Westerner to gain entry into the formidable Forbidden City, stand out. In his letters, Ricci articulates profound admiration for the Confucian moral system and boldly proposes that the Vatican adapt Catholic doctrine to Chinese culture, rather than simply imposing it. Not everyone within the Vatican concurred. The archives meticulously record fierce debates within the Vatican that raged for decades, centered on the contentious question of whether Chinese converts should be permitted to continue their ancestral rites alongside their Catholic faith. Ultimately, Pope Clement XI issued a decree formally forbidding what became known as the Chinese rites. This pivotal decision severely damaged relations with the Qing dynasty, and by 1721, missionary activity in China was entirely prohibited. Another file, classified under Highly Confidential Diplomacy, contains crucial documents concerning Vatican-Japan relations. Among these is a letter written in intricate Chinese characters from Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1610, translated and preserved with remarkable directness. Your religion disrupts the internal order. It divides fathers and sons, masters and servants. I do not allow it. What followed was a long, tragic series of reports. Mass executions of Catholics in Nagasaki, priests brutally burned alive, and churches systematically demolished. Yet, from those chilling fragments, I discerned astonishing resilience, handwritten letters by imprisoned Japanese believers, sent to the Vatican via Portuguese trading ships, often penned in blood on mere scraps of cloth. There was no mysticism, no dramatic embellishment, only the raw testimony of human beings who profoundly believed in something greater than themselves, and who paid the ultimate price for that unwavering conviction. Then, I ventured into a distinctly different world, the documents relating to Vietnam. The historical current here possessed its own unique character, caught perpetually between East and West. Between the enduring tenets of faith and the complex demands of sovereignty, between the fervent missionary impulse and the intricate web of politics. One file from 1790 meticulously preserved a letter from Bishop Pignot de Béhaine to the Vatican, reporting his relentless efforts to assist Prince Nguyen, who would later become Emperor Jia Long, in rebuilding his forces and reclaiming his throne. That letter was far more than a mere missionary report. It was living evidence that Catholicism played an undeniable role in shaping modern Vietnamese statehood, not merely as a foreign religion, but as a significant agent in the very act of nation-building. However, the archives also record the darker chapters, the severe anti-Christian edicts of the Nguyen dynasty, the brutal executions of believers, and the desperate pleas emanating from besieged missionaries. One document from 1833 recounts the Le Van Khoi rebellion, noting its partial support from Catholic communities and the Vatican's cautiously measured reaction. "We must not allow faith to become entangled with rebellion." That single line reflected a quiet tension between the fervent desire to protect the faithful and the pervasive fear of being drawn into uncontrollable local conflicts. In the 20th century, the Vatican-Vietnam relationship grew even more complex. One file covering the period from 1954 to 1975 is dense with reports on Catholic life in the North, the significant mass migration to the South, and the discernible influence of the Saigon government in episcopal appointments. A letter from Pope Pius XII to President Ngo Dinh Diem offered blessings but carried a subtle, underlying message. A national leader has the duty not only to defend the faith but to ensure justice for all his subjects. It was one of the few documents penned in a tone that was simultaneously supportive and cautionary. What troubled me most, perhaps, was a special file documenting the ultimately failed efforts to restore diplomatic relations between the Vatican and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam after 1975. Internal notes unequivocally reveal the Vatican's immense patience, its repeated offers for dialogue, and its persistent hope to re-establish a humanitarian channel. Yet, every meeting concluded at the level of polite formality. A 1989 memorandum stoically read, "We must wait. Patience is part of the mission," even within the pages that remained silent. I could palpably feel the immense weight of history. Every letter, every crimson seal, was more than mere administrative paper. It was an enduring trace of the long and often arduous interaction between civilizations. The Vatican did not always act correctly, nor did it consistently fully comprehend the East. However, the sheer presence of thousands of documents concerning Asia at the very core of the Vatican is irrefutable proof of something far deeper. This was never a separate world, it has always been a living, enduring part of global history. Internal conflicts and financial scandals, the Vatican's human face. I once perceived the Vatican as an unyielding, unified whole, a perfect organizational pyramid devoid of any internal dissent. However, it was only by delving deep within the archives that I truly began to comprehend a more complex reality. The Vatican is also a living entity, replete with disputes, inherent contradictions, and at times, silent struggles among those who don the pristine white robes. One specific section of the archive is starkly marked, Sub Secreto Ponteo, under papal secrecy. It contains meticulously kept records of discreet confrontations between popes and cardinals, or between former popes and their successors. These documents are never made public as long as the individuals involved remain alive. They are only archived after those events have receded into history or after the individuals in question have relinquished their offices. A particularly revealing set of files chronicles the persistent tension between Pope Paul VI and Cardinal Giuseppe Siri, once considered a prominent candidate for the papacy. During the Second Vatican Council, Siri vehemently opposed the modernization of the Church, ranging from the replacement of Latin with vernacular languages during Mass to engaging in dialogue with other religions. Internal records showed that he privately wrote to Paul VI, denouncing what he perceived as the dismantling of the sacred. The Pope's terse reply was only 2 lines long, but unmistakably cold. The shepherd cannot wait for the hesitation of the gatekeeper. The disagreements extended beyond mere theology. The Vatican also harbored deep fractures within its financial governance. One of the most scandalous and thoroughly documented episodes in the archives is the Vatican Bank crisis, involving the Istituto per l'Opera di Religione, IOR, or Vatican Bank. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, I still recall holding a thick, typewritten dossier, nearly 600 pages long, chillingly titled Caro Calvi. It directly refers to the notorious case of Roberto Calvi, an Italian banker found hanged under London's Blackfriars Bridge in 1982. The press infamously dubbed him God's banker, due to his intimate connections to the Vatican Bank. His death was officially ruled a suicide. But the documents preserved in the Vatican Archives narrate a different, more intricate story. Inside were myriad bank statements, a plethora of letters exchanged between the IOR and Banco Ambrosiano, unsettling records of suspicious loans, and revealing lists of accounts maintained by various front organizations in Panama. A handwritten memo from a bishop voiced a grave concern. "We are using sacred assets for activities dangerously close to sin," but this ominous warning was disregarded. The files also document internal efforts to systematically reorganize records to thwart any legal investigation by Italian authorities. At least 3 documents were explicitly labeled, "Destroying, to be destroyed." For reasons unknown, they were never actually destroyed. Equally sensitive is the file concerning VatiLeaks, the scandal involving leaked Vatican documents. Many still remember the name Paolo Gabriele, Pope Benedict XVI's personal butler, who notoriously copied and smuggled out numerous confidential files. In the archives, a dedicated box meticulously preserves the full timeline of the incident, from the initial internal investigation to Gabrielle's own handwritten confession. In his confession, he penned, "I did not betray the Holy Father. I only wanted the Church to know what was happening behind closed doors." The leaked documents exposed severe internal divisions within the Roman Curia, revealing factions, rival interest groups, and intense power struggles over influence. Many of the papers starkly exposed financial favoritism, rampant corruption in ecclesiastical appointments, and concerted efforts to suppress scandals involving ethical and criminal behavior. Every line represented a profound fracture in public trust. The fact that the Vatican chose to prosecute Gabriele in an open court was a rare indication that the long-standing wall of silence had at last begun to crack. I once posed a direct question to a priest who managed the archives. "Why does the Vatican preserve documents that could potentially harm its own reputation?" He merely smiled, then offered a response I have never forgotten. "Because the truth does not belong to us. It only passes through us." The Vatican Archives do not attempt to erase the past. They preserve it, sometimes in profound silence, sometimes in deep sorrow, as an unspoken act of accountability. And that, more than any marble statue of a saint, is what renders this place profoundly human, a space where power, faith, and undeniable failure are recorded indelibly in ink, not in transient water. The unspoken dialogues, popes, presidents, and global powers. There is a little-known fact: not every meeting between a head of state and the Pope is publicly announced to the outside world. Press releases typically offer only a few staged photographs of handshakes and a boilerplate diplomatic statement emphasizing mutual understanding, cooperation, and peace. However, within the hallowed depths of the Vatican Archives, I discovered handwritten records of what was truly spoken behind those closed doors. These were exchanges that were sometimes strikingly blunt, occasionally deeply emotional, at times marked by sharp disagreement, and always meticulously inscribed in ink formulated to endure for centuries. One of the most arresting files contains a detailed record of the meeting between Pope Pius XII and Nazi Germany's ambassador to the Holy See, Diego von Bergen, in 1939. This pivotal encounter took place just after Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia, and tensions with Poland were rapidly escalating. In the internal note, the Pope, while refraining from issuing a direct condemnation, pointedly asked, "Does your government still control the hatred it has sown within German society?" The ambassador offered no direct answer. The file concludes with the chilling remark, "The atmosphere turned markedly cold." There was no closing prayer. A seemingly minor detail, yet it speaks volumes. Shifting to the 1960s, I came across the record of a meeting in 1965 between Pope Paul VI and Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. Publicly, the meeting was lauded as a historic endeavor to reopen dialogue between East and West. But in the archival transcript, the scribe noted, "The Soviet delegation stated that religion is a tool for distorting historical truth." Paul VI responded gently yet firmly, "No one can forbid another from believing in the sacred. That is not power. It is part of the human soul." Then, without further comment, he invited the entire delegation to stand in silence for 1 minute in honor of all unknown souls who died for ideals. The Soviet side never mentioned this powerful gesture in any official record. Another notable set of files is simply titled, USA Visit Reserve 8, United States Unpublished Visits. Inside are confidential notes from private meetings between various popes and American presidents, ranging from Roosevelt and Eisenhower to Kennedy, Reagan, and George W. Bush. One entry records a poignant moment from Pope John XI's meeting with President John F. Kennedy in 1963. President Kennedy expressed deep concern over the escalating risk of nuclear conflict following the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Holy Father posed a profound question. Who will remain calm first when the world no longer has a moral foundation to stand on? Strangely, both men had precious little time left after that meeting. Pope John XI passed away just months later, and Kennedy was tragically assassinated at the end of that same year. The file draws no direct connection. But the close proximity of these events led some within the archives to mark it as particularly sensitive. Not only global superpowers are represented in these meticulous records. I once encountered an old, faded file detailing a meeting between Pope John Paul II and General Secretary Gorbachev in 1989, just prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Gorbachev, though not a religious man, remarked in the meeting record, "If we do not change, there will be nothing left to preserve." John Paul II responded with a single, profound line. "Truth rises when people grow weary." Following that conversation, the Vatican became one of the first institutions to anticipate the unraveling of the Eastern Bloc. Some of the most surprising documents originated from smaller nations or countries lacking long-standing diplomatic ties to the Vatican. In a file marked, Vietnam Colloquy Non-Official, I discovered an internal memo from 1991. An unofficial Vatican delegation had held talks with representatives of the Vietnamese government in Geneva. While no formal agreement was reached, a clear willingness for dialogue was expressed. This represented one of the earliest, quiet steps toward restoring contact after 1975, not through sensational media headlines, but through handwritten words recorded in profound silence. The Vatican possesses no military power, nor does it command a vast economy. However, what I came to understand after poring over these records is this: when a world leader seeks genuine sincerity or counsel unburdened by political gain, they inevitably gravitate towards the Holy See. And the Vatican comprehends this reality intimately. It rarely needs to speak loudly because every single page it preserves holds the inherent power to reshape the understanding of an entire generation, if revealed at the opportune moment. Law, scandal, and the unseen art of the Vatican. One of the distinct qualities that sets the Vatican apart from every other religious institution in the world is its dual nature. It is not merely a church, but also a sovereign state. Consequently, it possesses the authority to sign treaties, issue diplomatic communications, and even face legal action. It was within one of the least discussed sections of the Vatican Archives, Causae Juridic, legal cases, that I encountered a remarkably different side of the Holy See. In these pages, the prevailing language shifts from one of prayer to the precise, often stark, terms of legal argumentation. Few would anticipate that the Vatican, a place synonymous with the sacred, would ever be compelled to appear before a court of law. Yet, in reality, since the early 20th century, there have been hundreds of legal disputes involving the Vatican, both internally and with various foreign governments. One voluminous file meticulously details the famous legal conflict between the Vatican and the Italian government following the signing of the Lateran Treaty in 1929. The core issue was not merely about borders or privileges, but specifically about the ownership of hundreds of buildings, churches, and monasteries scattered across Italy. One memorandum unequivocally states, "We cannot allow sacred ground to become negotiable property, but neither can we allow it to be nationalized without condition." The arduous negotiations dragged on for years, at times threatening to escalate into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. The Vatican was compelled to furnish legal proof of property ownership dating back to the medieval period, often leveraging original documents meticulously drawn from these very archives. Inscribed in Latin and bearing the signatures of popes as far back as the 12th century. Thanks to these historical proofs, many Catholic properties continue to retain their legal inviolability even today. However, perhaps the most agonizing and deeply unsettling documents are those pertaining to cases of sexual abuse within the Church, which erupted into global public consciousness in the early 2000s. Filed under a sensitive category marked Casi Disciplinari Privati, confidential disciplinary cases, I perused documents no seminary had ever prepared me to expect. One file detailed an internal investigation from 1962 in a North American diocese. The victim was a minor. The perpetrator was a priest who had already been reported multiple times. Yet in the memo, the directive from higher authority was chillingly clear. Transfer this individual to another parish. Do not make the matter public. Avoid scandal for the community. No warning was ever issued to the subsequent congregation. Years later, the very same offense tragically recurred. This was far from an isolated case. Similar files emerged from Ireland, Germany, Argentina, and the Philippines, some of which were never even covered by the media. Letters from victims reached the Vatican, sometimes handwritten with a trembling script. "I don't know who else will listen. Please don't pretend nothing happened." Some received no reply, others were simply labeled for internal review. The Vatican has never denied that abuse occurred, but it consistently approached the issue as an institutional crisis, rather than simply as a matter of individual crime. Since 2001, the Holy See has indeed implemented stricter disciplinary procedures, and many files document that gradual, albeit agonizingly slow, shift. Yet, what silenced me most was the sheer, protracted slowness of change. In a 2010 report, one bishop acknowledged, "We were so afraid of scandal that we forgot who it was we were supposed to protect." Beyond abuse cases, the Vatican has also confronted numerous international lawsuits concerning disputed assets, particularly in the aftermath of World War II. One file from 1997 documents a case brought by descendants of Jewish families, alleging that the Church held gold and valuables looted by the Nazis. The Vatican denied direct responsibility, but the file remains archived under unresolved claims. Another highly sensitive case involves the Vatican museums, which house tens of thousands of artifacts originating from across the globe, including items from countries once under colonial rule. In one petition from Peru, the government formally requested the return of a ceremonial Incan mask. The Vatican responded with a formal statement. "This artifact is a record of history. It carries no ownership value but belongs to the memory of humankind." The matter, like so many others, was left unresolved. The archive never offers conclusions, it only preserves evidence. But as one meticulously reads through hundreds of legal briefs, lawsuits, pleas, and carefully worded replies, one comes to understand that the Vatican is not removed from the world. It is drawn into it, layer by layer, by the very inherent nature of being human. And when humans err, even those adorned in white robes, the paper records remain impartial, devoid of emotion, yet utterly impossible to deny. The genesis of Scripture and the unseen truths of belief. There exists a section within the Vatican Archives that even many Catholic scholars have never had the privilege to access. This is not because it is the most heavily guarded, but because it demands a very particular kind of linguistic knowledge, Koine Greek, ancient Hebrew, and the Latin of the early Church. This hallowed place is informally known as the First Manuscripts Room, a sacred chamber that safeguards the foundational texts of Christian belief, ancient Bibles. The earliest surviving translations, and even the seminal writings that were ultimately excluded during the formation of the Scripture we recognize today. The first time I entered that section, I scarcely dared to breathe, not from fear, but from a profound sense of reverence. Standing amidst millennia of handwritten words, meticulously inscribed by hand on animal parchment, using ink concocted from ash roots, and what felt like the very tears of those who believed their words were divine in origin. Tucked inside a worn wooden drawer lay a copy of the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest surviving Greek Bibles, dating back to the 4th century. Its text is not identical to the printed Bibles we are familiar with today. Some passages are conspicuously missing. Others differ significantly in their wording, and remarkably, there are entire sections of narrative that no longer appear in the modern canon. A striking example is the ending of the Gospel of Mark. Modern versions typically conclude with Jesus appearing to his disciples after the resurrection. However, in the Codex Vaticanus, that conclusion is notably absent. The text abruptly ends with the words, "And they were afraid." This textual discrepancy has long fueled intense scholarly debate. Is the widely known ending a later addition? And the Codex Vaticanus is not an isolated case. In a small metal cabinet secured with 3 locks, I once saw a folder explicitly labeled Evangelia Apocrypha, containing the apocryphal Gospels that were intentionally excluded from official scripture. Among them were the Gospels of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and Philip, writings famously rediscovered at Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in 1945, though the Vatican had possessed copies long before. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, comprises 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, but strikingly arranged without any discernible narrative structure. One particular saying reads, "The kingdom of God is within you and all around you." If those words genuinely originated from Christ, they raise profound theological questions about the very necessity of the Church as an intermediary between humanity and the divine. Perhaps for this reason, such texts were never canonized. Even more controversial is the Acti Pilati, the Acts of Pilate. This document presents the Roman governor's purported defense after ordering Jesus' crucifixion. In it, Pilate describes Christ as a man unlike any who ever lived, whose eyes shone like fire, and whose words flowed like living water. The mythical tone of the account may well explain its exclusion from the official New Testament. Yet, its very presence reveals that even Roman officials once sought to comprehend the crucifixion in their own unique language. Beyond these ancient texts, the archives preserve countless letters exchanged between medieval popes and major theologians. These letters capture intense, often impassioned, debates over whether certain books, such as the Revelation of Enoch, the Book of Wisdom, or the Maccabees, should be included in the Bible. In one particular letter from Pope Damasus II, he penned, "We do not reject them for falsehood, but because the hearts of men are not yet ready." That single sentence has haunted me ever since. How much of Scripture is truly divine truth? And how much is the result of decisions made under immense historical pressure? Another record details a closed session of the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The first major convocation of Christian bishops from across the Roman Empire convened to formalize doctrine. The minutes include a list of texts discussed, many of which no longer exist. A side note from a Greek scribe reads, "Certain writings are to be retained for deeper theological study, not for public reading." This suggests they were not destroyed, merely withheld, and may still rest in locked drawers like the ones before me. The archive does not declare what is unequivocally right or wrong. It remains silent, meticulously preserving every interpretation, every variation, every subtle fracture in the sprawling history of belief. Some may find that unsettling, but I do not. For what makes faith truly resilient is not perfect uniformity, but rather its inherent ability to survive intense debate, continuous revision, and even the deepest of doubts. The human popes, doubts, reforms, and unsent letters to the outside world. The Pope is a paramount symbol of unwavering steadiness, the direct successor of St. Peter, the living embodiment of continuity and unshakable Catholic faith. But within the secretive confines of the Vatican Archives, tucked away behind private files, confidential correspondence, and unpublished notes, lies a reality few dare to imagine. The Pope is profoundly human. They have experienced fear, grappled with doubt, and at times, visibly collapsed under the immense weight of events beyond their immediate control. I still vividly remember the first time I stumbled across a folder simply titled, "Letter non inviats, never sent." Inside were handwritten drafts by several popes, never printed, never answered. These were not formal diplomatic letters nor official decrees. They read like raw, intimate pages from a personal diary, where men at the very zenith of spiritual authority meticulously inscribed what they could not bring themselves to utter aloud. One of the most haunting was penned by Pope Benedict XV in 1917. At the brutal height of the First World War. It was addressed to the leaders of Europe, pleading desperately for an immediate ceasefire so that humanity might not completely lose its soul to the incessant thunder of artillery. But the letter was never dispatched. A chilling note in the margin, written by the Cardinal's Secretary of State at the time, read, "No one will listen. And if they do not listen, your holiness will appear weak." The letter was subsequently folded and shelved, forgotten, until I serendipitously stumbled upon it more than a century later. Another file marked, "Reserved per conclave, reserved for conclave," contained materials written by some popes specifically for their successors. These documents were never intended for public consumption, only for private reading by the College of Cardinals during the papal election. One such memorandum, a substantial 12 pages long, was penned by Pope Pius XI in 1938. Precisely as the Nazis were consolidating their power and anti-Jewish laws were rapidly spreading across Europe. In that memorandum, the Pope expressed profound concern that certain segments of the German Church had begun to silently cooperate with the fascist regime. He issued a stark warning. "If we remain silent, history will not speak of our wisdom. It will speak of our complicity." That powerful document was never read. Pius XI died shortly before he could issue a public encyclical unequivocally condemning antisemitism. The memorandum remained in the archive, sealed and silent. One particular file left me standing motionless for a protracted period. It contained records concerning Pope John Paul I, who served for a mere 33 days before his sudden and enigmatic death. Many conspiracy theories have inevitably swirled around that event. But in the archives there was no grand intrigue, only the stark, cold truth of internal memos revealing that the Pope had been preparing a sweeping reform of the Vatican's financial administration, including significant changes to the Vatican Bank and a comprehensive review of secret accounts linked to various Italian financial institutions. In one of his handwritten notes, he wrote, "The Church cannot preach purity if it is not transparent itself." That line was underlined 3 times, but he tragically never had the opportunity to act upon it. And in a meeting record held shortly after his death, one cardinal wrote, "We must continue the mission, but we must not touch the structural foundations." That sentence has echoed in my mind ever since. Even beloved popes like John Paul II and Francis have left behind handwritten letters heavy with raw emotion. One unpublished draft by John Paul II, composed during the height of the abuse scandal, vividly displays his clear inner conflict. I do not know if I have done enough. Every night I pray not only for forgiveness from God, but from the victims I have never met. His handwriting was simple, yet the words possessed an immense weight. Much like the papal tiara he wore for over 2 decades. Pope Francis, renowned for his profound closeness to the people and his reformist spirit, also has letters that have never been made public. One was addressed to a cardinal convicted of abuse, in which he wrote, "The sin of an individual does not destroy the Church, but the covering up does." An attached memo revealed that fierce internal debate continues within the Vatican concerning the elusive boundaries of forgiveness and transparency in the modern age. The Vatican Archives never speak aloud, but its pages, yellowed, trembling, and perpetually unseen by the public, carry what no press release could ever adequately convey. That beneath the resplendent glow of authority, the chair of Peter is also a profoundly solitary journey. And even the head of the Church experiences sleepless nights. Just like any other soul in the world. Beyond the sacred, intelligence, finance, and secret societies. When people contemplate the Vatican, their thoughts invariably turn to chapels, prayers, and profound theology, rarely to telescopes, intelligence reports, or complex financial contracts with foreign banks. And yet, it is precisely these seemingly secular elements that occupy a considerable portion of the deepest layers of the Vatican Archives, where the Holy See's unofficial ties with worldly powers have been meticulously recorded, line by painstaking line. One of the first folders that utterly stunned me bore the title, Conti Rivati Intelligence. It contains documents detailing secret communications between the Vatican and various Western intelligence agencies during the Cold War, particularly with the CIA and MI6. In one memo dated June 17, 1953, just weeks after the coup in Iran, a CIA representative in Rome met with a Vatican cardinal to discuss anti-communist developments in the Middle East. The report was succinct. The Holy See is morally supportive, will not intervene directly, but is willing to encourage local churches to promote democratic values in opposition to atheism. No formal agreement was signed. But the underlying message was crystal clear. The Vatican was not merely observing the world, it possessed the moral stature to significantly influence the flow of ideologies, especially through the powerful conduit of faith. Another memo from 1979 records a secret meeting between a CIA operative and Vatican officials shortly before Pope John Paul II's historic visit to his homeland in Poland. The CIA expressed particular interest in whether the Polish Pope could inspire the burgeoning Solidarity movement. The Vatican made no explicit promises, but the memo noted, "We are aware of our role. But the gospel is not a strategic tool." This was a meticulously crafted diplomatic response, neither agreeing nor denying, yet leaving ample room for silent action. Another set of files, labeled Relation Reservate, Israel, documents clandestine contacts between the Vatican and Mossad, Israel's formidable intelligence agency. The correspondence includes Vatican requests for the protection of Christian holy sites in Jerusalem amidst escalating tensions between Jews and Palestinians. A Mossad report sent back to the Vatican tersely stated, "We do not care about the religion of the person standing in a sanctuary so long as they are not hiding weapons." The Vatican's reply was equally terse, yet profoundly telling. "We do not hide weapons. We preserve memory." The next layer I encountered had nothing to do with espionage, but everything to do with finance. A folder titled, Banker a Potter, Banking and Power, meticulously chronicled the Vatican's intricate relationships with numerous international financial institutions, including Banco Ambrosiano, UBS of Switzerland, and various financial entities in Panama. The files contain a wealth of information, wire transfer records and extensive investments in real estate across London, Paris, and even luxurious resort properties in South America. An internal report from 1985 notes, "A portion of investment returns will be redirected to the charitable funds of the Holy See." No public disclosure required. The core concern was not that the Vatican was investing, but that it utilized shell companies to avoid scrutiny. Some accounts were listed under the names of pastoral foundations, but were in fact managed by financial directors of private banks. There were no overt signs of abuse. But the structure was so profoundly opaque that tracing funds was nearly impossible. And perhaps, that was precisely the underlying intent. What surprised me even more was a small, unnumbered, unstamped folder bearing only a handwritten title. Rapporti non-official Fraternita Reservate. This was a record of confidential encounters between high-ranking Vatican officials and representatives of Western secret societies, including the Freemasons, a group historically condemned by the Catholic Church. One memo dated 1969 records a bishop in Switzerland meeting with a senior Freemason of the European Lodge to explore possibilities for dialogue on human rights and freedom of conscience. No definitive conclusions were reached, but notably, Vatican policy began to shift thereafter, moving from outright prohibition to a more cautious stance of merely discouraging participation. This created a nuanced gray area in doctrine and implicitly allowed for interfaith dialogue with groups once branded as heretical. I found no conclusive evidence of a grand conspiracy or direct Vatican manipulation of world events. However, I clearly discerned that the Vatican does not exist in isolation. It maintains a sprawling network, undeclared, unpublicized, yet quietly active for centuries. And its archives meticulously preserve every handshake, every letter, every unofficial meeting. As if history unfolds not on a grand public stage, but in the hushed wings, behind the drawn curtain. The enigmatic rituals, conclaves, canonizations, and hidden symbols. When one steps into the Vatican, the very first thing that typically captivates the eye is the radiant light, from the dazzling stained glass windows, from the opulent gilded brilliance of the Sistine Chapel, from the flickering candles and shimmering statues adorning the grand basilicas. But few are consciously aware that alongside that effulgent light, there exists another, more profound realm, one of profound silence, deep contemplation, and intricate rituals so complex they border on the mystical. And within the Vatican Archives, what unsettled me most was not merely political documentation, but the records of these very rituals themselves. These are manuscripts that have never departed from the ancient stone walls, read aloud only a single time, then meticulously locked away behind drawers secured with 3 brass latches. One of the most astonishing documents I encountered was a handwritten manual titled Ordo Rituum Conclavis, spanning over 80 pages and meticulously detailing the precise sequence of steps involved in organizing the papal conclave. The original cannot be copied or publicly released. It is not merely a descriptive text, it is a living document, containing whispered prayers, solemn sealing rituals, and even coded signals utilized among officials to ensure that no information whatsoever escapes. A particularly striking section records the profound oath of the Ceremonier Segreto, the secret master of ceremonies, tasked with upholding absolute silence during the conclave. The oath itself is not fully written out, showing only its opening line. I swear before God and the shadow of St. Peter. The remainder is transcribed in an abbreviated Latin code, intelligible only to the innermost circle. A chilling note in the margin reads, "Should the oath be broken, every prayer within the sanctuary will lose its virtue." Whether symbolic or literal, the profound gravity of that sentence was impossible to disregard. Another document I came across was cryptically labeled, "To be used only when there is no pope." This was Ordo Exec Pontificis Maximi, the internal protocol meticulously followed upon the death of a pontiff. It details every single moment, from who is first permitted to enter the papal chambers, to who seals the doors, to the precise sequence for public announcement. One passage in particular sent shivers through me. Before announcing to the world, "The Camerlengo shall call the Pope's name 3 times in Latin through the closed door. If no response is heard, he shall declare the Holy Father deceased." It is not merely a ritual. It is the ultimate symbol of both profound authority and stark mortality. I also encountered a short manual reserved for a truly rare event. Canonization Extraordinaria. The extraordinary canonization of a saint outside the usual, protracted process. Only 8 pages in length, it contains a series of rather strange prescriptions. For instance, the relic must be a non-decomposable element. The ceremony must last precisely 3 hours. No more, no less. And, most intriguingly, the individual who proclaims the title must have a blood or spiritual bond with the saint's community. Whether these unique rules are still enforced remains unclear. But the document itself remains untouched, a silent testament to ancient customs. One of the least known files was titled, "The Symbolist Non-Publicist, on Non-Public Symbols." It meticulously catalogs the secret symbols, specific items, and designated colors utilized by the Vatican in urgent or truly exceptional situations. For example, a red cord diagonally tied across a Vatican chamber signifies that the room is undergoing theological deliberation, meaning a doctrinal crisis is currently under discussion. Or, a small bottle of deep brown ink, famously known as ink of silence, is used exclusively to write texts that are never to be made public. Each symbol is accompanied by meticulous explanations in archaic Latin, understood solely by the highest echelons of the clergy. But what haunted me most was a thin, black, leather-bound book without any title, marked only with a chilling date. Dram Selvi, April 3, 1945. Inside was a ritual never actually enacted, prepared for the grim scenario in which Rome fell into the hands of fascist forces or the Soviet Red Army. It meticulously outlined how to seal holy relics, how to systematically destroy sensitive documents, and described a sacred rite called Benedictio Ultima, the final blessing, to be performed only if Vatican sovereignty were completely lost. No one has read that blessing aloud since it was written, but it remains there, lurking in the shadows, silently awaiting a moment the world devoutly prays never arrives. The Vatican is undeniably a state, but it is equally a ceremony. And within its archives, ritual is not merely an action, it is the very language of memory. Every handwritten prayer, every crimson seal, every sacred phrase spoken only once in centuries, they are all indispensable components of this intricate structure. Not out of mere superstition, but out of the profound belief that in a world that shifts and changes with each passing day, some things must be meticulously preserved, if only to remind us that we once believed in something eternally enduring. The Index of Forbidden Knowledge, Conflict between Faith and Intellect. In a quiet, secluded corridor, tucked away in the northern basement of the Vatican Archives, I serendipitously stumbled upon an old wooden box, intricately carved with a single, profound word, index. There was no protective seal, no explanatory guide. But inside lay a long and fraught history, the perpetual tension between the relentless pursuit of knowledge and the unwavering tenets of faith. Meticulously preserved in its entirety by the Vatican. Every book title, every precise reason for its prohibition, every intense internal debate that never reached the public eye. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or List of Prohibited Books, was officially established in 1559 by Pope Paul IV, at the very zenith of the Counter-Reformation. For over 4 centuries, it became the single most powerful instrument of censorship wielded by the Holy See. However, what is preserved within the archives is far more than just a mere list. It is the intricate process itself, the intense deliberations, the heated arguments, and at times, the deep-seated contradictions among theologians, clergy, and even the popes themselves. In my hands I held a yellowed, typewritten record from 1907, the minutes of a pivotal meeting of the Congregatio Pro Doctrina Fidei, the office specifically charged with safeguarding doctrine. In it, members passionately debated whether to add historian Ernest Renan's Vie de Jesus, Life of Jesus, to the index. Some argued that Renan blasphemed by portraying Jesus as a mere historical figure, rather than divine. But one courageous bishop vehemently opposed the ban, stating, "If we forbid him, we acknowledge his influence." The book was ultimately banned, but the dissenting argument remains meticulously preserved, revealing how censorship within the Church was not always a unanimous decision, but often a profound struggle between the defense of faith and the inexorable demands of the modern age. Another file, nearly 300 pages long, was labeled with a single, evocative line, "Galileo, Galilei." It contains every single document tied to Galileo's infamous trial. Not only the final sentence, but also handwritten pleas for leniency, private notes from bishops who opposed his condemnation, and even letters from later generations, including Pope John Paul II's formal acknowledgement of the Church's egregious mistake in 1992. One record from 1633 chillingly reads, "We do not condemn science. We condemn the arrogance that seeks to rise above revelation." That sentence still profoundly resonates, especially today. As scientific theories once deemed dangerous, such as evolution and the Big Bang, are now unequivocally accepted by the Vatican as not incompatible with faith. Beyond books, the Church once maintained a specific body focused on art and media, which I later discovered had its own file titled Cinema Ed. This section contains detailed evaluations of films screened in Catholic countries from the 1920s through the 1980s. Some entries were notably unusual. A review of Fellini's La Dolce Vita noted, "Excessively secular but accurately portrays the emptiness of a world without God." The conclusion, "Banned from Catholic schools but not publicly condemned because a loud ban would only increase its appeal." Another folder records the Church's response to philosophical or allegorical literature. It includes a discussion of George Orwell's 1984, which some suspected of critiquing religious totalitarianism. But internal documents concluded, "This is a condemnation of secular totalitarianism." No response necessary. This reveals that Vatican censors were often subtle analysts, not merely reactionary, but remarkably selective in their battles. Perhaps the most intriguing file was marked, "Internal circulation only, do not reproduce," meticulously detailing the Vatican's internal review of The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Although many clergy publicly denounced the book, internal reports clearly stated its impact lay in exploiting the public's ignorance of religious rituals and symbols. The recommended response was not condemnation but education. Rather than banning the book, the Vatican strategically responded with a series of counter-publications. A significant shift from traditional censorship to active engagement. The index was officially abolished in 1966, but the files remain, quiet, untouched, lined up on Vatican shelves like a perpetual reminder. The greatest power lies not in outright prohibition, but in subtly shaping how and when people receive an idea. And for centuries, the Vatican has not merely safeguarded the faith, it has profoundly shaped the very threshold of knowledge, meticulously deciding how far it should open, precisely when, and to whom. The Crusades. A legacy of faith and bloodshed. When I stepped into the section labeled Crusada, an uncanny, profound silence enveloped everything around me. Gone were the 20th century maps, the diplomatic telegrams, the polished dossiers exchanged between envoys. What remained were ancient parchment scrolls, stark black ink, and crimson wax seals, once pressed between the very fingers of the most powerful men in Europe. This was where the Vatican meticulously preserved what remained from a time when faith was tragically transformed into war. The Crusades, purportedly carried out in the name of holiness, left behind indelible stains of blood on the map of history that no amount of prayer could ever truly erase. One of the very first documents I discovered was the original crusading bull of 1095, Deus Vult, God Wills It, issued by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont. Written in Latin, it begins with an urgent, impassioned plea. The Holy Land has been seized. The blood of the faithful cries from Jerusalem. The Catholic must march. There is no explicit political agenda. No mention of land or wealth, only a fervent call to arms. And yet, that very call ignited more than 2 centuries of relentless warfare, claiming the lives of millions under the looming shadow of the cross. Subsequent documents, particularly from the time of Pope Innocent III, vividly demonstrate how the Crusades evolved into a highly structured campaign, no longer merely a spontaneous spiritual appeal, but a complex logistical operation involving taxes, systematic recruitment, intricate supply chains, and even explicit rewards. I meticulously read letters exchanged between the Vatican and various European lords, discussing the precise number of knights, provisions, and, most troubling, the explicit right to seize the property of those who refused to convert or join the cause. A particularly striking document dated 1204 records the Vatican's internal reaction to the Fourth Crusade, which, instead of reaching Jerusalem, infamously sacked Constantinople, the very heart of Eastern Orthodoxy. In the minutes penned by Cardinal Pietro Capuano, there is a chilling admission. We let the sword lead, not the spirit. We did not conquer heresy. We looted our brethren. Although Pope Innocent III issued a formal, albeit restrained, condemnation of the pillage, no reparations or apologies ever followed. But what haunted me most were not the wartime documents, but rather the post-war ones. A file titled, Requiem pro Error, a Prayer for the Error, preserves the Vatican's profound reflections and acknowledgments of the past. Inside was an unpublished speech draft by Pope Paul VI, intended to be delivered during his 1960 visit to Istanbul. It poignantly reads, We brought war into places that once knelt in prayer. We cannot claim this was God's will. The speech was controversially withdrawn at the very last moment, and replaced with a more neutral address. But the original remains here, silently reposing beneath layers of dust. The Vatican Archives also preserve records of lesser-known crusades, the Northern Crusades against pagans in the Baltics, the Albigensian Crusade in southern France aimed at annihilating the Cathars, and even campaigns directed against disobedient Catholic monarchs. A record from the 13th century documents a bishop who staunchly refused to join a crusade, stating, I do not see God in fire and blood. He was promptly stripped of his office shortly thereafter. Still, the archives also bear witness to later efforts of dialogue and reconciliation. A folder titled Reconciliate holds extensive correspondence between the Holy See and the Orthodox churches of Russia, Greece, and Armenia, communities still profoundly scarred by the Crusades. In a letter from 1999, Pope John Paul II wrote to Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, If blood once divided us, let prayer begin to mend the wounds that history left behind. It wasn't a formal public apology, but it undeniably marked a beginning. In all these documents, I did not discover an inherently evil or ruthless Vatican. But I clearly observed an institution that once wielded faith as a justification for war, and that slowly, over many centuries, learned to engage in profound self-reflection. None of these texts deny the brutal past, but they also do not attempt to whitewash the present. The Vatican Archives do not seek to justify, they preserve. With a solemn fidelity to memory and with the deep-seated belief that truth, however bitter, is an essential component of ultimate redemption. Women in the silence of the Church. Unresolved questions. One quiet, rainy afternoon, while I was diligently searching for documents related to medieval church councils, an elderly archivist subtly pointed toward a small, solitary wooden box nestled at the very end of a shelf and whispered, You should read this. This is where the Church keeps what it never officially declared, yet never truly discarded. Because even they knew some women once helped lay the very foundation of faith. The box itself bore no name, only a cryptic catalog number and a handwritten note. Myers and Silentio Ecclesiae. Women in the silence of the Church. Inside was not a vast trove of documents, but rather a collection that contained a quiet, persistent current of history that the Vatican has never officially acknowledged, not because it was rebellious, but because it raised a question that remains profoundly unresolved. What is the true place of women in a faith structure ruled almost exclusively by men for nearly 2 millennia? I began my exploration with a set of handwritten letters from the 12th century by Hildegard von Bingen, a remarkable German nun, composer, theologian, and visionary. Most of her writings, in Latin and Old German, meticulously recorded spiritual visions of profound theological and philosophical depth. In one powerful letter to Pope Eugenius III, Hildegard boldly wrote, "The soul of a woman is also breathed into being by God. So why must her voice pass only through the mouths of men?" Remarkably, the letter was not met with condemnation, but with a calculated and deliberate silence. Still, Hildegard was not branded a heretic. On the contrary, several voices within the Roman Curia openly praised her, yet consistently maintained a respectful distance. In one internal record, I discovered the poignant line, "This woman is not wrong, but the Church cannot yet permit women to teach from the pulpit." Her immense intellect was clearly recognized, yet an invisible boundary remained, one that she and countless other women were never permitted to cross. Delving deeper, I unearthed another file titled Manualium Scripture, Writings of the Nuns. It was a captivating collection of prayers, poems, and liturgical texts composed by women in religious orders spanning from the 9th to 16th centuries. Among them were prayers that were both graceful and defiantly assertive. "I do not ask to be priest. I ask to tend the flame unseen, burning quietly in the darkest chapel corner." These profound words were never formally spoken in official rites, but they were copied by hand, meticulously passed from nun to nun, their brown-black ink still visibly etched on parchment softened by the relentless passage of time. The most haunting section, however, was the file on heresy investigations, particularly those specifically targeting women whose spiritual influence grew too extensive. A 1321 case from southern France meticulously recorded the trial of a group of women accused of unauthorized preaching, even though they had merely held Bible readings and shared their personal interpretations. One interrogation transcript chillingly reads, "Do you believe women can interpret the Word of God?" The woman, named Clara, bravely replied, "If God chose a virgin to bear him, why would he not choose her tongue to proclaim him?" The record abruptly ends. She was burned at the stake. And yet, not all voices were silenced. In the files from the Second Vatican Council, I found letters and internal minutes documenting serious discussions on expanding women's roles in the modern Church. A handwritten note from Cardinal Sunens read, "It is not enough to bring more women into the Church. We must admit they have always been here." From 1965 onward, Vatican commissions began including women as theological advisors. But as one document explicitly stated, "Consultano non diter," meaning, they may advise, but they do not decide. More recently, I came across minutes from a 2016 meeting discussing the intriguing possibility of female deacons. A group of female theologians presented compelling historical evidence that deaconesses were recognized in the 1st to 3rd centuries in early Christian Greek texts. One cardinal pushed back, arguing that was not the same as ordination today, but another, whose name was redacted in the version I read, penned a profound line. "If a truth must be hidden because our current structure cannot contain it, then the fault is not in the truth." That powerful sentence made me sit in silent contemplation for a long time. The Vatican Archives did not erase these women, but it has never fully placed them in the light. They remain like slanted footnotes in the margins of history, not loud enough to echo from pulpits, but undeniably strong enough to withstand the relentless winds of time. And as I carefully closed that old wooden box, I finally understood, the Church was not built solely of stone and men. It was built with the unwavering hands of women who laundered vestments, painstakingly copied sacred texts, raised generations of believers, and in profound silence, carried the flickering flame of faith through its darkest centuries. Crimes and cover-ups, the Vatican's hidden flaws. The Vatican is often perceived as a moral sanctuary, a pristine symbol of unwavering faith and boundless forgiveness. However, the undeniable truth is that wherever humans exist, mistakes are inevitable. And within the ancient stone walls encircling St. Peter's Square, those mistakes don't always originate from external forces. Sometimes, they emerge from within. In a chilling section of the Vatican Archives marked Da Reservata, Reserved Crimes, I began meticulously exploring a series of case files that had been sealed away for decades. There was nothing mystical about them, no ancient curses, no dark conspiracies, only mundane paperwork, official signatures, and chillingly meticulous transcripts. These were disquieting records of criminal acts committed within the very institution that ceaselessly preaches grace and virtue. One of the earliest files I encountered detailed a theft in 1969 from the Sacred Relics Repository. This was the chamber where hundreds of holy artifacts were reverently stored, including saintly bones, martyrs' robes, and handwritten scriptures dating back to early Christianity. According to the report, a young monk assigned to clean the vaults secretly took a small box believed to contain relics of St. Lawrence. He made no attempt to sell it, instead, he kept it in his room, bizarrely claiming he could hear the saint whisper in his dreams. The Vatican convened a closed trial, no journalists, no public announcements. The verdict, no criminal prosecution. But the monk was laicized and permanently expelled from Vatican territory. A note attached read, "This action stemmed from misdirected faith, not greed." Perhaps that was why mercy prevailed. Another case, far more grievous, occurred in 1982, the murder of a teenage boy of Vatican citizenship inside the Vatican Gardens, mere meters from the Pope's office. The case file, labeled Castle Ag 82, revealed the victim was the son of a Vatican Treasury employee. His body was discovered near the southern wall, bearing clear evidence of blunt trauma to the head. The prime suspect, a gatekeeper with a documented history of mental instability. The internal investigation spanned over 400 pages, meticulously detailing every step of the interrogation and examination. The suspect was described as having lost control due to religious anxiety and psychological isolation. Yet, instead of being handed over to Italian authorities, the Vatican dealt with the matter internally. He was confined to a secluded monastic facility, completely cut off from the outside world, and never faced public trial. The final line of the report reads, "The peace of the faithful must be preserved more than the curiosity of the crowd." The Vatican operates under its own unique legal system, primarily based on the Codex Juris Canonici, or canon law. However, since the 1929 Lateran Treaty, it has also selectively adopted parts of Italian law, particularly in severe criminal cases. Still, jurisdiction largely remains with Vatican courts, where judges are typically high-ranking clergy or cardinals. In the archives, I encountered a list of judges from 1929 to the present, names that appear nowhere in public records, yet wield enormous authority in cases that could profoundly shake the Church's moral foundation. Another notable file pertained to suspected money laundering involving the Vatican Bank during 2009 to 2011, though briefly touched upon by the press. The documents I saw contained internal account records and transcripts from confidential meetings between bishops and financial advisors. A 2010 report stated plainly, "There was negligence in monitoring transfers from the Opus account to a bank in Liechtenstein. No formal charges were ever filed." But shortly thereafter, the bank's director resigned. No press release, no press conference, just a single note in the minutes of his final meeting. "We choose to carry the wound rather than expose it to public carving." One of the most haunting cases, and perhaps the most shrouded in enduring mystery, remains that of Emanuela Orlandi, a 15-year-old girl and Vatican citizen who vanished in 1983. Her case has persisted for decades, spawning countless theories involving the Italian mafia, convoluted political plots, and alleged Vatican cover-ups. Inside the archives, the related file is labeled Reservatissimo, denoting top secret. I was only permitted to see a mere handful of pages dated 1985, including a memo stating that the Vatican received an anonymous letter claiming Emanuela was alive and being held for political negotiation. There was no official response. One cardinal wrote, "If the claim is false, replying invites chaos. If true, silence is our last hope." And so, the Vatican chose silence, for 40 years. The archives are not a courtroom, but they are where the unspoken judgments are meticulously kept. Not always to conceal, but because in a place as small and symbolically immense as the Vatican, every sin becomes systemic. Every failing is not just a personal misstep, but a visible crack in the moral foundation shared by millions. And so, the Vatican often chooses to handle such sensitive matters in shadow, quietly. With law but without revealing light. Hidden masterpieces, the Vatican's unseen art. If the Vatican is considered a vast treasury of faith, then art serves as the gleaming golden key that unlocks the deepest layers of the human spirit. The magnificent fresco on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the pristine marble sculptures, the luminous stained glass windows that eloquently narrate the scriptures through vivid imagery, all have become indelibly etched in the collective memory of humankind. But what few truly realize is this: some works of art, sketches, preliminary studies, even fully completed paintings, have never been seen by the general public. They remain in profound silence, carefully hidden within the secure vaults of the Vatican. One misty morning, I was led down into a quiet basement, discreetly tucked away behind the Vatican museums, a space never included in any guided tour. Beyond 3 formidable iron doors, I discovered a small vault designated Deposito Revato, the reserved painting repository. Here are housed artworks that have not yet undergone official evaluation, have never been publicly displayed, or have been withheld for being incompatible with the current theological direction. No one speaks this aloud, but what I witnessed inside will forever remain etched in my memory. The first rack I approached held an unpublished sketch by Michelangelo, a haunting charcoal figure drawn on darkened paper, reaching out in raw pain and poignant longing. It bore a striking resemblance to the iconic creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel, but instead of receiving divine light from God, this figure was tragically surrounded by an oppressive darkness. A handwritten note beneath the drawing starkly read, "Non-destined for the chapel. Too human." I found myself pondering what could render a Michelangelo drawing unworthy of the Vatican's sacred walls. Perhaps it expressed a profound truth that theology fears to confront, that humanity is not only a creature destined for redemption, but also one abandoned to despair, not always reaching toward the light. On another shelf rested 2 oil paintings, bearing the faint, almost faded signature of Raphael Sanzio, though his name had been subtly covered over in gray ink. An accompanying study noted that the style of these works was too worldly for the rest of his known oeuvre. One depicted a pregnant woman holding a crucifix, a striking image deemed theologically inconsistent, since the Virgin Mary is never portrayed in this manner. A small annotation beneath read, "Confusion domino may cause doctrinal confusion." And so, a potential masterpiece was veiled, not because it lacked beauty, but because it dared to raise unsettling questions. I also came across a captivating painting attributed to Caravaggio, which had never been put on display. It depicted St. Peter, not yet an apostle, as a humble fisherman, dirt on his face, gripping a torn fishing net. No divine light, no halo, no sacred symbols, just a tired man at the very genesis of faith. Was that the reason it was withheld? Because it lacked the sanctified image of a purified saint, or because it felt disturbingly too real? A different folder, labeled Iconographia Contestata, contested iconography, meticulously listed artworks that had been formally requested to be removed, covered, or never reproduced. Among them were sculptures of the Virgin Mary portrayed with African and Asian features, crafted by local artisans during missionary periods. A 1911 Vatican Cultural Council memo noted, "Diversity is part of divine creation, but uniformity is necessary to preserve sanctity." Under that restrictive logic, many such profound statues were never permitted to grace altars. There was even a special section dedicated to modern art, documenting Vatican decisions to decline exhibitions or collaborations with major contemporary artists like Salvador Dali, Francis Bacon, or Ai Weiwei. A 1950 internal document revealed Dali had proposed a series of surreal revelations of the saints. Vatican officials responded, "We cannot allow sacred imagery to become obscure visual metaphor." But the Vatican does not destroy these works, quite the opposite. They are preserved with meticulous care, each crack, each brush stroke, each layer of pigment painstakingly documented. And yet they choose to keep them hidden. Not because the art lacks intrinsic value, but because in the blinding clarity of theology, what is too human, too raw, too unfinished, may profoundly shake a faith that intrinsically relies on certainty. When I finally left that vault, I did not carry away images of radiant angels or sacred crucifixes. I remembered only the eyes covered in dust, the eyes of paintings never seen. And I wondered, perhaps what the Vatican withholds from the world is not out of fear of losing belief, but fear of confronting a version of faith still profoundly in progress, where saints and sinners, heaven and earth, are still in fervent debate, still unfinished on the vast canvas of existence. The Vatican and the cosmos, faith, science, and the unseen universe. When people reflect upon the Vatican, their thoughts instinctively gravitate towards chapels, fervent prayers, and profound theology, rarely to telescopes. And yet, between the expansive realm of faith and the boundless cosmos lies a quiet, often overlooked path. The Vatican is home to one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world. And within its venerable archives, what is preserved is not merely star charts, but a long, intimate history of both tension and profound harmony between heaven and earth, between unwavering belief and relentless intellect. My journey into this celestial section began at a small filing cabinet explicitly labeled Specular Vaticanana, the official name of the Vatican Observatory. Inside were handwritten records spanning from the 17th to the 20th century, meticulous notes on comet sightings, awe-inspiring solar eclipses, and the appearance of strange, enigmatic stars in the night sky. One particular notebook dated 1610, a copy from the original records of Christopher Clavius, the renowned Jesuit astronomer who significantly contributed to the design of the modern Gregorian calendar, reads, "The stars are not disorder. They are signs of an order we do not yet understand." In that single line, I discern something profoundly revealing. The Vatican never truly turned its back on science. It simply chose its own terms of engagement. Another cabinet held documents not of condemnation, but of intense internal scientific debate regarding the Galileo affair. I found a 36-page report from 1616, penned by a group of clerics meticulously trained in mathematics and astronomy, seeking to argue that a stationary Earth was natural and in perfect harmony with Scripture. Yet, in a marginal note, a young priest quietly posed a profound question. Should we not question why Scripture is silent on centrifugal force? The question was never formally raised in court, but it was carefully preserved, as if the Vatican intrinsically understood that not all doubts constituted heresy. Then I unearthed a document never publicly released. A handwritten draft by Pope Benedict XIV, dated 1741, explicitly calling for the rehabilitation of Galileo's name. It was never officially published. Yet the Vatican chose to keep it, perhaps because some acts of profound redemption do not necessitate grand proclamations, only a silent reader in quiet contemplation. By the 20th century, the Vatican's files expanded to include international scientific collaboration. A folder from 1935 recorded the Vatican's sponsorship of an expedition to Africa to observe a total solar eclipse. In a letter sent back to Rome, the expedition leader eloquently wrote, "Faith does not prevent us from measuring darkness. It is because we believe in divine order that we dare to quantify the vanishing of light." Another document from 1981 described a private symposium held at the Vatican between theologians and quantum physicists. One Swiss professor presented the multiverse hypothesis. The reaction was not outright rejection, the minutes noted. If God is infinite, the universe need not be singular. A rare and remarkable statement, but a clear sign that the Vatican had quietly, yet profoundly evolved. No longer merely a rigid guardian of fixed truths, but a house engaged in continuous dialogue with the ever-widening frontiers of human understanding. I even discovered fascinating correspondence between the Vatican and NASA, particularly around the momentous time humanity prepared to set foot on the moon. A handwritten letter from the Holy See to President Kennedy, dated 1962, read, "We pray for those who dared to leave Adam's sky to witness the Creator's work from without." When Apollo 11 successfully landed, the Vatican did not hold public celebrations. But in Pope Paul VI's private journal, one profound line was recorded. "Today, man does not merely gaze upon the heavens. He has touched them." To my utter astonishment, I also found a copy of a letter from Stephen Hawking to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, dated 1990. In it, he questioned whether God was even necessary in cosmological origins. The Vatican did not rebut. A theologian, in a confidential note, penned, "If God must hide in the gaps of equations, then he is not truly eternal." That admission, never made public, conveyed more to me than 1,000 sermons. Genuine faith, when authentic, does not fear challenge. Today, the Vatican Observatory still operates quietly from Castel Gandolfo. They issue no loud declarations. They do not engage in arguments with modern science. But in their archives, I witnessed something even more profound, a faith that does not extinguish reason, but constantly dares it to its furthest boundary, so that when the last starlight fades, something immeasurable may still remain. Diplomatic encounters, the Vatican and non-Christian empires. One late afternoon, as sunlight from the magnificent dome of St. Peter's Basilica slanted into the lowest levels of the Vatican Archives, I opened a drawer meticulously marked, "Residential Diplomatica ex Orient at Bori, diplomatic records from the East and the North." Inside were not treaties of the European kind, nor pacts exclusively with Catholic kingdoms, but a compelling series of letters, messages, and transcripts of contact between the Vatican and vast empires that did not share the Christian faith. In these interactions, where belief systems did not align, power dynamics still necessitated intricate dialogue. I commenced my exploration with a dossier from the 16th century, detailing the early exchanges between the Vatican and the formidable Ottoman Empire. A letter dated 1584, dispatched by Sultan Murad III to Pope Gregory XIII, was composed in Ottoman Turkish, accompanied by a Latin translation. In it, the Sultan addressed the Pope as leader of the believers in the triune God, and proposed a commercial pact to ensure mutual respect for sacred territories. The Vatican's reply did not reject the proposal. Instead, it stated, "When peace opens the path to prayer, there is no need for the sword of faith." This was a strange tone. Cautious yet profoundly yearning for a shared order between two civilizations long portrayed as irreconcilable. In another folder from 1713, I found the transcript of a secret meeting between a Vatican envoy and representatives of the Qing dynasty, held in Macau. It meticulously recorded the Holy See's concern over Emperor Kangxi's decree banning Christianity following the rites controversy. The internal note read, "The court does not reject faith but rejects the denial of Chinese rites. We may withdraw the decree if it does not harm sacred doctrine." No formal agreement was reached. But the very existence of this dialogue revealed that the Vatican had come to recognize that introducing faith into another culture required humility, not rigid dogma. What struck me most was a never declassified file titled, "Negotiation cum Moscovia." It contained records of secret efforts from the 17th to the 19th centuries to establish relations between the Vatican and the Russian Tsars. In a memo from 1860, the Vatican noted that the Russian Orthodox Church had become the arm of imperial authority, and that without dialogue, reconciliation between the churches would remain impossible. A private letter from Pope Pius IX to Tsar Alexander II included the poignant line, "When the throne seeks eternity, It must listen to the voice of the eternal throne. There was no recorded reply. But the Vatican steadfastly continued to write. In a document from 1902, the Vatican recorded contact with a Japanese scholar representing the Meiji court. The two parties engaged in discussions about theology, culture, and the intriguing possibility of coexistence between Christian charity and the honor of Shinto. One line in the transcript stood out with striking clarity. The East does not reject faith. It rejects imposition. It read like a profound reminder to the Church itself. Truth is not a gift that can be forcefully imposed upon another. I discovered a 1954 internal memo, penned just after the conclusion of the First Indochina War, in which the Vatican proposed dispatching a secret envoy to North Vietnam to observe the condition of Catholics following the Geneva Accords. There was no official order, no public document. But in the file, the envoy's handwritten note read, "I saw priests celebrating Mass in silence, vestments hidden under civilian clothes. Faith here makes no noise, but it has never died." The report was never published. One of the most moving files was a compilation titled Via Pacis, The Path of Peace, containing the complete correspondence between the Vatican and the United Nations from the end of World War II to the present day. In a 1965 note, when the Vatican became a permanent observer, a cardinal wrote, "The Church has no army, no vote, but it may still whisper into the conscience of the world." That line remains undeniably true, though today the world hears those whispers less clearly than before. None of these records boast of influence. On the contrary, they consistently portray a Vatican often in a weaker position. The one initiating contact, the one actively seeking common ground, the one striving relentlessly to understand its interlocutor. In the vast shadows of geopolitical power, the Vatican was never a superpower, but it possessed another potent weapon: time. The Vatican knows how to wait. And when it waits long enough, dynasties inevitably collapse. Revolutions burn themselves out, and the Holy See continues to write letters, meticulously preserving even the replies that were never sent. Miracles, prophecies, and the unexplained. When people utter the word miracle, they often conjure images of radiant light, weeping statues, or celestial hymns echoing from the heavens. But when I first stepped into the section labeled Supernaturalist Recentio, Review of Supernatural Phenomena, I saw no light, smelled no incense, heard no sacred sound. Instead, I saw documents, thousands of pages of reports, stark black and white photographs, haunting audio recordings, dry medical transcripts, and long columns of clinical analysis, all meticulously filed like a crime scene investigation room. The first file I opened concerned the famous events of Fatima. The apparitions of the Virgin Mary in Portugal in 1917, still widely revered as a miracle. But what the Vatican preserved most carefully was not the content of the visions, but the rigorous process of verification. A memorandum dated October 26, 1930, dispatched by the Archbishop of Leiria to the Holy See, noted, "We interviewed more than 60 witnesses, photographed the sun during the foretold times, yet detected no optical distortion in the cameras." However, descriptions by the locals were remarkably consistent regarding the movement of light. The Vatican did not deny it, but neither did it unequivocally proclaim a miracle. Instead, it recorded, "By theological and pastoral criteria, the event is acceptable for devotion but not binding for belief." That same cautious conclusion appears repeatedly across the archive's records of apparitions, never an outright denial, but always a careful, measured distance. Another case was that of Lourdes, France, in 1858, where the young Bernadette Soubirous claimed to have repeatedly seen the Virgin Mary in a grotto. The Vatican's file preserved detailed transcripts of every interrogation, from local doctors to senior clergy. One line in the document read, "The girl displays no signs of hallucination. Yet, the figure she describes does not match doctrinal conceptions of the Virgin at the time." Eventually, the Church did not directly validate the visions, but rather the inexplicable recoveries from illness that followed pilgrimages to Lourdes, and the Vatican never rushed to judgment. In another file, I read about the 1973 apparitions in Akita, Japan, which were not officially recognized by the Holy See until over 20 years of meticulous investigation had passed. Doctors, psychologists, and theologians were dispatched, and each step was accompanied by internal reports. One particularly telling note read, "The weeping statue of the Virgin is chemically verifiable but scientifically inexplicable. This does not make it a miracle. It makes it worthy of monitoring." Then I found a striking registry called Cozy Ray, Rejected Cases. In it were hundreds of reports deemed fabricated, exaggerated, or simply lacking supernatural merit. There were photographs of statues dripping water due to plumbing leaks, audio recordings definitively traced to human manipulation, and witnesses who later retracted their initial claims. In one Latin American case, the supposed visionary confessed to having been paid by a pilgrimage group. The Vatican report simply stated, "Secular motivation, file closed." Another part of the archive held cases of unexplained healings. The Vatican maintains an independent medical panel called Consulta Medica, which rigorously evaluates every supposed miraculous recovery. One file from 2002 described a Parkinson's patient who fully recovered after praying to Blessed John Paul II. The attending physician confirmed the recovery. Still, the Vatican noted, 5 additional years of observation required to rule out natural remission. No haste. No sentimentality, just a process as rigorous as any clinical trial. One small file I stumbled upon bore the name Aurora Messina, a 17-year-old girl in Italy who, in 1966, claimed to receive nightly divine prophecies during full moons. Crowds gathered at her home, but internal Vatican notes stated, "After 7 months of observation, no objective evidence was found." The divine voice in her room was ultimately traced to a hidden speaker installed under her bed by her brother, who later confessed he only wanted to protect the faith of the villagers. The case was sealed with a red stamp. Deception for notoriety. But perhaps the most haunting file was one without a date titled Lux Inter Cos, Light Among the Blind. It contained a testimony by an elderly priest living in a mountain monastery in Switzerland. He claimed to have seen a glowing child in the snow one night, but when he approached, it vanished. He did not seek recognition, he simply asked the Holy See to record his account so that, if anyone else ever sees it, they will not think themselves mad. The Vatican neither rejected nor affirmed it. One line from the examiner's note read, "Silence is the only way to preserve the sacred." The Vatican does not chase wonders. It observes. It doubts. It meticulously measures every tear from a statue, every unexplained light, every whispered prayer in the fields. And in that profound silence, it chooses to preserve what it does not yet understand, not to display, but to remind itself that if God truly reveals himself, he will not require trumpet blasts or sensational headlines. He will arrive in moments no one expects, and no one hears, except for those patient enough to wait, as the Vatican has done for centuries. The prophecy of Saint Malachi, fact, fiction, and the unfolding future. I never intentionally sought out the prophecy of Saint Malachi. For many within the Vatican, that name evokes more discomfort than reverence. Yet one day, while I was researching documents related to early 17th century councils, I stumbled upon a thin file tucked inside an unrelated dossier. Its cover was marked simply, De Prophetia Malachi, unpublished version. Inside was a handwritten copy dated 1595, the same year the prophecy was first printed in Rome by Father Arnold de Wyan in his work, Lignum Vitae. The reason the Vatican preserved this manuscript was not out of belief, but to monitor how it spread. A marginal note by Cardinal Baronius read, "The people are enamored with this prophecy as if it were a fifth gospel. But faith built upon fear is not faith. The prophecy of St. Malachy is said to have been written by the Irish Archbishop Malachy O'Morgair during a pilgrimage to Rome in 1139. In it, he supposedly listed 112 Latin mottos, each intended to correspond to a future pope, from Celestine II up to the very last, who, it is foretold, would witness the fall of the Holy City and the Day of Judgment. In the Vatican Archives, I found an internal table, never made public, meticulously mapping each prophetic phrase to an actual pontiff. Some connections were eerily accurate. Lumen in Caelo, light in the sky, was linked to Pope Leo XIII, whose coat of arms bore a radiant star. Pastor Angelicus, the angelic shepherd, fit Pius XII, revered for his spiritual life. But the further down the list, the weaker the connections became. Ultimately, a Vatican memo from 1978 concluded, "This is the effect of reading backward. People assign meaning to what has already passed, not what is to come." Still, what prevented the Vatican from outright denouncing the prophecy was the chilling final line. In persecution strepit, Petrus Romanus. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, Peter the Roman shall sit upon the throne, and then the city of 7 hills shall be destroyed. And the dreadful judge will judge his people. Then came 2013, Pope Benedict XVI resigned, the first papal abdication in 6 centuries. His successor, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, took the name Francis, born in Buenos Aires, but of Italian descent, carrying Roman blood, though no pope has ever taken the name Peter II. The Vatican suddenly received hundreds of letters from the faithful around the world, all asking the same urgent question. Is this the final pope? One internal document I found recorded a meeting of the cardinals in 2014, just months after Francis's election. During it, a young bishop expressed concern that this prophecy is being weaponized to fuel apocalyptic anxiety and undermine reform. The dean of the college replied simply, "The Church does not fear the end. We only fear that people stop living for tomorrow." Another file titled, Legendum non publicandum, to be read, not published, documented a Vatican commission that had once investigated the true origins of the prophecy. Several scholars argued the entire text was written in the late 16th century to support specific candidates in a papal conclave. One historian asked bluntly, "If Malachy truly wrote this, why is it never mentioned for 400 years?" But in the end, the Vatican reached no official conclusion. The file concludes with a line that says, "We do not publish what may confuse even in order to deny it." And so, the prophecy remains a ghost, either authenticated nor erased, either confirmed nor condemned. It has become part of the mythos surrounding the Vatican, like hidden staircases, secret chapels beneath the basilica, or whispers of angels during papal elections. Is it real? Does it matter? Perhaps those questions no longer require definitive answers, as one elderly bishop once whispered to me while turning the final page of that prophecy. There are words God never spoke but left behind for men to decide whether to believe or not. The unanswered echoes of the Holocaust. Pius XII and the Archives. The archive labeled Archivio poi Anadigera, Archive of Pius XII, remained meticulously sealed for more than 70 years. It was not until 2020 that portions of it were finally declassified. But even those disclosed were merely the surface. When I stepped into that room, the fresh air of the Vatican hallways seemed to vanish, replaced by an invisible, oppressive weight. These were pages unstained by blood, yet heavy with the silent deaths of millions. I opened a folder titled, Letter non res post, 1942, Unanswered Letters. Inside were dozens of desperate pleas from Jewish communities across Europe, written during the most brutal years of the Holocaust. One letter dated August 1942 came from a rabbi in Slovakia. It read, "We do not ask for a public intervention. We only ask that you affirm that God is not silent." There was no reply in the file, only a faint pencil mark on the margin. Forwarded to the Secretariat of State, response pending. Another folder recorded Vatican contacts with Nazi officials. In a memorandum dated November 1939, the German ambassador to the Vatican, Diego von Bergen, pledged, "The Reich will respect religious freedom if the Holy See maintains neutrality on internal matters." Cardinal Maglione, then Secretary of State, replied, "We do not intervene in politics, but we will speak if innocent life is threatened." And yet, if that voice ever spoke, it never reached the public. One internal report shook me to the core. A document addressed directly to Pope Pius XII, dated October 1943, just weeks after Jews in Rome were brutally deported by fascist authorities, stated, "Nearly 1,000 Jews were taken from the city on October 16. The train departed from Tiburtina station, destination unknown. The report was signed by a Jesuit priest from a local parish. There was no directive attached. But on the following page, in faint, trembling handwriting, someone had written, "Could not prevent, prayer is the last recourse." I found no handwritten orders from Pius XII commanding silence, but I found its undeniable absence in speeches, messages, and public declarations throughout the period when Jews were being slaughtered en masse. A folder titled, Discursi Mananti, Missing Speeches, contained drafts of 3 addresses that were never delivered. One of them, dated December 24, 1942, bore the title, Sicut Stella in Nacht, like stars in the night. In it was the poignant line, "We grieve for the millions of innocents destroyed, whether for their race, their faith, or their language." But that message was never read aloud. A note beside it read, "Would endanger German parishes, must wait." But the waiting never ended. Still, the Vatican did not remain entirely silent behind closed doors. I read hundreds of records documenting secret efforts to save Jews, especially through monasteries, churches, and religious institutions across Italy, France, and Poland. A 1944 file noted, Santa Brigida Convent has hidden over 200 Jews disguised as pilgrims. The abbot accepts personal responsibility if discovered. There were dozens more such cases. Yet, no public statement from the Holy See confirmed or protected these courageous actions, because a single word could have dragged hundreds out into the light and to their deaths. A letter from Bishop Angelo Rada in Budapest, dated 1944, read, "If we speak, they will kill more. If we remain silent, our conscience will die." There was no recorded reply. But in a private memo, I found a handwritten line, unsigned. "To choose between voice and life, no one is holy enough to choose rightly." After the war, a file labeled, Defensa Silent, Defenses and Silences, contained transcripts of internal meetings preparing for the coming wave of criticism. One cardinal suggested a public statement that the Holy See had quietly saved lives during the Nazi reign. The proposal was rejected. Instead, the Vatican chose continued silence and allowed the world to debate. One final note read, "We do not speak. History will find the words, and history has never stopped searching." Some argue Pope Pius XII lacked courage. Others contend he did all he could within the inherent limits of his office and the tumultuous times. But what I witnessed in the archives was not a definitive judgment. It was the fractured record of a moment when moral clarity was pushed to its absolute limits. There were no heroic proclamations, no explicit apologies, only the lingering truth of a cold, stark reality. Silence, whether born of profound fear or strategic calculation, leaves an enduring echo that cannot be erased. The enduring mystery, why the Vatican preserves all. After hundreds of hours of diligent reading, turning page after worn page, deep beneath the earth where no bells ring and no candles flicker, I began to ask myself, why does the Vatican meticulously preserve all of this? Skeptics might argue it is to control, to conceal, to avoid facing uncomfortable truths. But if that were the sole intention, why not simply destroy it all long ago? Why preserve with such meticulous care and precision every internal memo, every unanswered plea for help? Every draft of a speech never delivered? I gradually came to a profound understanding. The Vatican doesn't merely preserve truth, it preserves the inherent complexity of truth. in those archives. There are no simplistic justifications, no blatant lies. There are gaps, profound silences, and stories only half told. But there are also voices once buried at the very bottom of history. Questions that were never permitted to echo, and small, quiet acts that saved hundreds of lives without ever asking for public credit. The Vatican understands better than anyone that a truth spoken at the wrong time can transform into a dangerous weapon. And so, they choose to hold it, not to manipulate, but to patiently wait. They do not rush to open every door at once. They believe each generation should only know what it is truly ready to comprehend. And that, difficult as it may be, is also a profound form of responsibility. I still vividly remember the room at the far end of the Western Hall. A small chamber behind an old wooden door inscribed with the Latin words, Veritas temporis estate, truth belongs to time. Inside, there were no files, only a solitary wooden desk and a blank book. The elderly archivist whispered to me, "This is where no more questions are asked. Only listening remains." I sat there, not to write, but to silently reread every chapter one had encountered. From secret meetings with emperors to hidden works of art, from meticulous miracle investigations to the Vatican's profound silence during World War II, the often unacknowledged role of women, the complex interplay with science, and rituals never performed, all flowing like an invisible current through millennia. I did not depart with definitive answers, but I did leave with an unwavering certainty. The Vatican Archives are not where truth is buried, but rather where truth is rigorously protected from simplistic oversimplification. Truth does not always bring comfort. Sometimes it reveals popes who harbored doubts, saints who faltered, and angels in paintings that wear the face of profound fear. But it is precisely that kind of truth that, if faith survives, allows it to truly mature. And perhaps that is why the archive continues to open. Not strictly in line with the relentless march of history, but in sync with the evolving conscience of humankind. When we are brave enough to gaze upon the unvarnished face of faith, then the doors of the Vatican will finally open, not with a mere key, but with the quiet readiness to understand and, ultimately, to forgive. I did not leave the Vatican feeling as though I had exited a fortress of secrets, but rather a chapel patiently awaiting someone to return. Not to worship, but to listen, to history, to memory, and to oneself. If what you have just heard resonates as more than a mere story, if it feels like a door quietly opening to something profoundly deeper, if you believe that truth does not always reside on the surface, and that sometimes silence is its own eloquent form of storytelling, please consider supporting this channel by clicking subscribe. Do so not just to join us on the journeys ahead, but to help keep this kind of deep storytelling alive in a world increasingly crowded with noise. Your single subscription is akin to a candle lit among the shadows of an archive perpetually filled with memory and profound silence. Thank you for listening with patience and with heart. I'll see you in the next story.